This is a broader biofuel issue, but maybe on that I'll let exceptionally Mr. Carfenton react to this. You can. Monsieur Mahon, I know most of you, but don't hesitate to introduce yourselves.
As you. I'm a professor at the University of Aix-Marseille, former president of CIRAD, and former general director for research at the French Ministry of Education, Research and Technology. Well, food security claims to keep in mind two main points. First, that most of soil's reservoir for feeding the incoming population is located in wet tropical lands, and especially in Africa. And these soils have not the same behavior that soils in Europe. We cannot apply the same techniques without destroying soils. You can add a lot of phosphorus without destroying soils, African soils. That the main problem is not situated here. The second point is to have really more investment, as underlined for Brazil, should be done in education, research, and innovation, and of course, transferring results to the farmers as soon as possible. But not as engineers are doing. That means not just considering soils as a chemical box, sorry. And the last remarks is just to say that GMOs through the world cover not very far from 10% of cropped lands today. And even if forbidden in France and other countries, it's a real scientific progress. Well, for the moment, I have not to add something else.
Thank you. Mr. Hendricks?
Thank you. My name is Colin Hendricks. I'm at the College of William and Mary and also at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I wanted to pick up on one of the earlier comments that regarded sort of aggregate food availability. So, Louise, in your comments, you suggested that we will be able to feed the coming 9 billion people. I want to make the argument that we could have fed the existing people that we had in 2008. Just as an empirical matter, there was aggregate food availability on a per capita basis was higher in 2008 than it had been at any time in the last 50 years. Okay, so the real question is whether or not we're going to continue to divert a fairly large portion of our world cereal production into biofuels, or whether or not we're going to give up on what I believe to be a fundamentally misguided policy. So as a practical matter, since 2000, the amount of food, both cereals and meat, has increased in per capita terms. I think this is why it's important to distinguish between food availability and then food access. So the first simply refers to the amount of food that's available in a market. Obviously, aggregate production shortfalls, perhaps caused by drought or flooding or crop failure, make food scarcer and thus can cause acute food insecurity. Access, however, at the individual or household level is a function of the family's ability to pay for or produce food, and the presence or absence of social safety nets that can provide access for those who cannot pay. Thus, it's possible that chronic food insecurity, which is the type of insecurity that you're referencing when you talk about 1 billion people who are undernourished, right, that can coexist with very high levels of aggregate food production. So 65% of the world's chronically food insecure people live in 7 countries: Bangladesh, China, the DRC, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, and Pakistan. So prior to the 2007 and 2008 food price crisis, all but China were actually net exporters of food. Okay, this is why safety nets are very important, and policy interventions specifically need to be designed to cover those households and individuals who are most insecure. The big problem with food insecurity is the same problem it's been since time immemorial. It's a problem of poverty. Which brings me to, I guess, the question I wanted to pose back to Louise, who mentioned export bans. So out of all the big intractable problems that are associated with food security, it seems that in a forum where we're discussing global governance, one of the areas that we could fruitfully tackle is this issue of export bans. Right. So this is a classic sort of collective action problem. You'll forgive me, I'm an academic, so I like talking about collective action problems, whereby the entire world benefits from sort of more or less free and fluid markets for foodstuffs, but each individual country can benefit in times of scarcity or in times of high prices by closing itself off to world markets and therefore throwing the cost of adjustment back on their neighbors. All right. So in order for countries to put down that particular policy lever, we're going to have to come to some sort of collective decision about how to normalize food trade in a context where it's not currently normalized under the WTO. And so I'm hoping that potentially some of our panelists can talk about what they think would be the appropriate venue, either in Doha or maybe in the G20, for addressing these kind of issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Vijay Phadke is my name. I'm a lawyer and a tax advisor, and certainly not an expert in agriculture and food, but I have certainly a passion for food, and that's visible. But at the same time, I have great interest in the food and agro-business issues, and I've been observing it a lot, especially in my country, which is India. And we've seen a lot of policy issues, which you have very well put across, the statistics and the Doha rounds or some other rounds. I'm not in that aspect. I'm on a very practical issue, which I observed in India itself. Just going by the statistics, taking the cue from my friend over there, he said the question of availability. In my view, and I'm sure the Indian government will equally vouch for it, there is sufficient food in India. There's no doubt about it. And if I looked at the statistics, the amount of wastages that are there in India, if I can give you the statistics, but how many millions of tons of grain are eaten by rat or the monsoon, or the meat or the food or the milk, vegetables, on an annual basis, it's not less than 10 billion euros. Now, that's the kind of food that is being thrown and wasted, which could have easily fed a large number of people in India. So I'm not sort of India bashing over here or trying to find a solution to that. Is not going to be very easy, because we also have a policy issue in India. We import as well as export. I don't know why. I'm sure you can have other countries which also have same statistics of wastages. I don't know, in the nearby neighborhood of India, like China or Bangladesh or Thailand, I don't know where. I'm sure some sort of statistics would be available to show what is wasted. Why don't we tackle the practical issues of finding some kind of mechanism in the entire chain, food chain, right from the time you grow it till you feed the mouths, of preserving it, storing it, supplying it, and so on and so forth? Can't there be some kind of a policy, some kind of a debate about it? That's my practical little thought and an observation.
Thank you very much. I'll have one last question for this round, then I will let the panelists maybe answer it. Madame Erraqi.
Thank you very much. Could you allow me, please, to have two questions concerning our country, Morocco? And it's maybe far from the global governance, but it's a regional matter. Since the Morocco Green Plan is successful, and since in Morocco we have the largest area able to agricultural production, do you think we can have a dream that Morocco could become the Brazil of the Maghreb? And the second question, do you think that to increase agricultural production in Morocco, we should allow ourselves to use the GMOs since there is no debate on that point in Morocco?
Thank you very much. So let me go around the panelists actually in the order where we started. Madame Fresco.
Yes, thank you. Well, this is a very inspiring and rich discussion. I cannot do justice to all the comments, but let me tackle first the whole issue that several of you have raised is about production volume versus poverty. Obviously, malnourishment is an issue of poverty. It's an issue of access to food. And the whole question is how can we make sure that we improve that situation? This is a complex issue. It's not just a matter of lifting export bans or imposing export bans. If you look at the results of the first Green Revolution in India, that has actually lowered food prices, and the people who most benefited from that were the urban poor. Now, currently, on average in the world, 70% of the poor live in rural areas. So we have a major problem of poverty in the rural areas. The solution for that is not so much to lower food prices, because that is always a temporary thing, but to provide employment and income opportunities that allow people to actually buy their food. Now, we have actually two situations where people cannot get enough food. One situation is the chronic poverty situations, the countries that were mentioned, those 7 countries that have a large proportion of the world's food. But if you look at India and China in particular, they've been extremely successful of lifting people out of poverty. That's been the great success. The big changes to the world hunger statistics come from the fact that there was economic development in China and India. But there is another set of countries where hunger is chronic because there's actually not a functioning government. I mean, the situations in Sudan, in the Horn of Africa, in the Great Lakes region in Africa are in fact de facto situations of non-functioning or absent markets, absent governments, no purchasing power, people who have been displaced. And I'm afraid to say that I think these situations cannot be solved by any economic measure. They are political situations where peacekeeping is the first solution before you can do anything else. Having said that, the question then is really, how do we deal internationally with something like import bans, or put it differently, how do we deal with protecting the poor and the most vulnerable from food price fluctuations? I think personally that the rising price of food is not a bad thing at all. It has put the subject back on the political agenda. It is, as I said before, an opportunity for investment in agriculture, which is badly needed. But what people, the urban and rural poor, and farmers cannot deal with is price fluctuations. So if we're going to intervene in anywhere, we have to ask ourselves, what are the effects of interventions, not on absolute prices, but on price fluctuations? And this is where I have some evidence that things like an export ban actually have negative effects rather than positive effects. Because what an export ban does is provide an enormous disincentive for the local farmers. Because if you cannot export your stuff, then next year you're not going to sow or plant enough land. So while there may be a short-term relief for the poor, there is no long-term relief to the food production situation. So for all intents and purposes, it probably looks better to help the poor directly through some local purchase increase, for example, with food bonds or something like that, rather than intervening in export and import bans. But I mean, there is no blueprint situation that will solve everything. I think some of the speakers said, and I agree very much with that, there's a major difference in how countries have been able to cope with these price fluctuations, and that has all to do with the fact whether there are major food importers or not. And countries that are major food importers do not have a very good national production and have a fluctuating currency are in a very difficult situation. This applies, unfortunately, to a lot of African